We are back this week with another of the greatest hits from the Bible, a brief but fairly well-known story about Jesus. And after having preached last week on the lost sheep, I found myself thinking, didn't we just do this? So let's start by thinking back to last week. The final point of last week's passage was that God and all of heaven rejoice more over finding the lost than over the 99 that didn't need to be found. And in that context, the reference is to the Pharisees saying that he eats with sinners and tax collectors. So does anyone else find it just a little bit on the nose that today we are hearing a story in which Jesus is literally eating with a sinner/tax collector? It's as though the author of this gospel is saying, in case you didn't get it before, here's a real-world example of what I was talking about. And yet an interesting thing about Zacchaeus is that this is the only place in the entire Bible that he is mentioned. He gets these 10 verses, and the fact that he gets those verses as opposed to just being an unnamed tax collector or that this little story gets left out, it suggests to me that the author of the gospel found this important and really wanted to highlight the story, probably because he wanted to catch this point and make sure people understood it about Jesus seeking those who are lost. When I was discussing this passage with my wife and the fact that it seems somewhat repetitive and covering the same ground that we've just talked about, she suggested that perhaps this reflects the idea that if we could all grasp Jesus' message of God seeking the lost, or any of God's messages, with just one parable or story, then the Bible could have been a pamphlet. Sometimes we, as humans, need to hear a message presented more than once in order to really absorb it. And this certainly seems true, or as true, of Jesus' followers at the time as it is of us today. In the moment described in this passage, Jesus is essentially showing his followers the idea that he had previously described. Not just in the parable that we covered last week, but through several parables that all sort of cluster around there where Jesus is explaining this idea of seeking out the lost. And he is explaining it to those who are metaphorically the 99 sheep, those who are already following him, and explaining that he's continuing to go after the lost and showing it this time, to show that he continues to seek after those who are unrighteous, to use the language of today's righteousness versus mercy theme. And as I read this passage in several different translations, one of the things that stands out to me is the fact that Zacchaeus climbs into a sycamore tree. It seems an interesting thing to specify. It's not he climbs into a tree, it's always a sycamore tree. And I'm curious why it's important to the story that this be stated. So I tried to do some digging into the meaning of the sycamore and the significance of the sycamore in the Bible and what that might mean. And I found a few things that were a little interesting. The idea of the sycamore being a source of food and a source of shelter and shade in the desert, and so symbolizing an idea of protection and sustenance and community. And I found some references to the idea of sycamore being a place of the human meeting the divine, almost like a tree of life. Although I wonder if that symbolism is really just attached to this story and the idea that this is where Zacchaeus met the divine. Then in reading the notes more closely of the artist who created today's image for our Visio Divina, I noticed that she had approached the same question and actually came up with something that I think is really pretty intriguing. I'll read you just a little bit of what she said on the matter. The root word for sycamore is sukon, meaning fig. And as I did a study of other key words in the text, I noticed the same root word in sukofento, which is defrauded, which is used to describe what Zacchaeus did to his community. It was curious to me that the root word for defrauded was fig. So I dug deeper to find that the Greek word was from the phrase fig informer, or a person who would notify authorities if one was exporting figs from Greece without paying a tax. It seems these fig informers would use threats of exposure to extort money from fig farmers. This is where the word sycophant comes from, which evolves to more generally describe a malignant accuser from love of gain, which perfectly describes Zacchaeus. Jesus calls Zacchaeus out of his identity as a sycophant and into a new identity as a repentant host who invites Jesus into his home and redistributes his ill-gotten wealth. So it's interesting to me to have at least a possible explanation for why it's meaningful and relevant that we specify a particular kind of tree, that this actually ties into who Zacchaeus is as a person. And I think sometimes these kinds of little links that are visible in the text, if you were to speak the original Greek, can get lost literally in translation for those of us who are reading it in a different language thousands of years later. I also find it interesting that this typically translated as Zacchaeus being gladly coming down after Jesus calls him. And I think it's worth mentioning here that the Greek word chiron, which is actually more like joyful, is the word that's being used. It's the word that is the root of our word cheer. Through Greek to Latin to Middle English, it becomes our word cheer. But it's a sense of real joy, not just, oh, I gladly came down. It's joyfully coming down. It's joyfully responding to the call of Jesus. And I think that might be a little bit more descriptive of Zacchaeus' state of mind. But then we get to an interesting point of timing in the story, because there are a lot of translations that make it sound like he comes down from the tree, immediately people start to grumble about Jesus choosing to associate with him, and immediately Zacchaeus says in front of everybody, oh, I'm going to give up half of my stuff, I'm going to pay back everybody that I've ever stolen from, if I've stolen anything, which is not necessarily an admission of guilt, the way that it's phrased. And this seems to all happen very, very quickly. But it's interesting to me that in the contemporary English version, they've chosen to render it as, later that day, Zacchaeus stood up and said that he would do these things, which suggests that at least there's an interpretation that allows you to think this wasn't an immediate response. Perhaps this was, okay, he came down from the tree, he invited Jesus into his home, they started to eat, people were grumbling. His experience in that back and forth, that conversation with Jesus, that presence of Jesus, is the thing that made him say, you know what, I am going to turn over a new leaf. I'm going to do something different. I'm going to give away half of my things and become a better person as a response to the call and our interaction. So I'm not sure that there's a clear answer given to us in the text as to which of those it is, but I think it's worth thinking about that maybe it's not just an immediate thing, maybe it's the kind of thing that Zacchaeus and potentially us as well have to be in that space, have that back and forth with Jesus a little bit before we are able to commit. With regard to the grumbling of the crowd, one of the commentators points out that this is the same word used when the crowd was grumbling in last week's description of the Pharisees and the religious scholars who were so unhappy with Jesus and his desire to hang out with sinners and tax collectors. The point that they make is that grumbling, this concept of grumbling, is an acceptable sort of normative form of dissent in that culture. But that it's one thing to grumble against the political leaders. It's another thing entirely to be grumbling against God or grumbling against God's appointed representative in that culture at the time. It reflected a serious offense and a lack of trust in the divine. So it's something for us to consider whether, in fact, that grumbling was justified or not. Might we have been the grumblers if we were in that situation? If we figured, we've got it figured out, and we are already on the right path, and why is Jesus associating with unrighteous people Why is he hanging out with sinners? Might we have been the ones grumbling? In terms of this week's theme of between righteousness and mercy, Jesus' actions here reflect mercy, and the crowd and their expectations reflect righteousness. Specifically with regard to the idea that Zacchaeus was known to be unrighteous. Now, if this is indeed a spectrum between those 2 points, in the UCC, I suspect many of us probably lean more toward the mercy side than the righteousness side. But is there a place for us to also engage with and honor the righteous anger of the crowd in this story? Perhaps a certain amount of righteous anger is understandable, particularly if we relate to righteous anger in light of some of the things going on in our world today. This is another story that we approach from the perspective of being Christians quite a bit later in history, rather than being the original intended audience of the story. And maybe the original audience would have instinctively resonated more with the crowd than with Jesus and Zacchaeus, and their interaction. Perhaps this story was included by the author in the gospel with the intent of making the reader just a little bit uncomfortable. So we should probably be willing to sit with that a little bit ourselves. After Zacchaeus makes his declaration, Jesus says that salvation has come to his household because he too is a son of Abraham. And we know from later New Testament writings that Christians are considered adopted into the family of Abraham. But if you will permit me one minor additional study of Greek, the word which is translated as to or also a son of Abraham, that word is kai in Greek. And as I was taught it, kai can mean and kai can mean also. And also, kai can mean even. So I wonder if it's fair to understand that this phrasing could be, he is also a son of Abraham, or alternatively, he is a son of Abraham. A way of saying, even this person who you all think of as a sinner, even this person who has treated the community badly and has hurt the community, even he is in fact part of this family, part of the community, part of the people of God. So how do we apply a story like this in our own lives? I think that might depend a little bit on which character or characters in the story you relate to most. Perhaps this is a good reminder that Jesus seeks out the lost, and that doesn't always look the way that we would expect. And that it can include those that we might not have included if it were up to us. Or maybe the story is a reminder that we are sought after as well, because Jesus calls Zacchaeus down from the tree, and of course, Jesus calls us in a similar way when we are lost. So does that mean that you should be like Zacchaeus and give up half of your net worth to the poor or the church? Look, I'm not going to stop you. I'm actually the chair of stewardship, so please, if you want to, just shoot me an email, let me know. After all, I don't think that's the point, though. The point is more about being willing to hear God call you and joyfully responding by welcoming God when God calls you. And that is good news.